Typical cases of bilingualism. Now let us look at some of the typical cases of bilingualism as it exists in the society. Now let me remind you, when we are saying typical cases, that does not mean that these are the only forms according to which bilingualism can exist in societies. Rather, we are saying that these are the most common forms in which bilingualism has been found to exist in different societies. So, it is best to conceptualize multilingualism in different societies across a continuum. So, that means there are two poles or two ends. At one end, you might have a single group, a single unilingual group with more or less large group within that group that knows or speaks a second language for specific purposes. So maybe they have, for instance, the group speaks Urdu only and they use English or they learn English or French or German for specific purposes like education or for the working of the government. At the other end of the pole, there might be two or more than two different groups who have different mother tongues, but within these groups, there still exists a number of people who not only are able to speak the languages of each other, at least of one more group, but they might also have access to a lingua franca or a language of common use that is comprehensible and understandable by different groups. So the example of Pakistan is very much there and is well quoted over here. For instance, even if you take the small city of Karachi, you find people who have their mother tongue as Gujarati or Sindhi or several other languages that exist over there, and then they also know Urdu, which acts as a lingua franca across different communities. So the three main typical cases which we can say of the existence of bilingualism in societies are: number one, territorial bilingualism. Now, what happens in territorial bilingualism, that at times the countries geographically divide their states on the basis of language. For instance, you have this case of Canada where there are certain parts of Canada are French speaking and they have their official language as French. There are other parts of Canada which are English speaking and they have their official language as English. Similarly, Switzerland has 4 different languages as official languages, and then you have the example of India also, though with slight variation. Another case can be that of what we find in the context of Africa and Asia. Now, in these contexts, for instance, if you look at Africa, because that is an extreme example of this kind of case, is that people would know several languages. So if a child is at home, the child will be speaking one language. The child steps out, and the community would be speaking another language. You moves on to find work, there might be some other language, and in school there is another language. So what happens in these communities is that the children or the people are not just bilinguals, but they know a number of languages, usually 6 or 7 at a time, especially in African contexts. This might also be true or in Asian context in certain regions, and often in these circumstances or in these contexts there is a lingua franca. For instance, in Africa you have this French, you have this English, and at times also Spanish. This lingua franca, more often than not, is a colonial language that has been given to them from their colonial past. The third case of bilingualism is diglossic bilingualism. What is diglossic bilingualism? You have different languages, maybe 2 languages, 3 languages existing within a society, but they exist together in a complementary stage. That is, you have one language to perform one type of functions, and you have the other languages performing other type of functions. So there is no competition between these languages, and somehow to the speakers of those languages it is very clear which language will be used where.